My name is Peggy Ann Weil, but I was born Peggy Ann James in 1946.
And where were you born?
Santa Rosa Hospital, downtown San Antonio. June Edith Pike James was my mom, and Jesse Columbus James was my dad. There were two other kids. There was Thelma, who was born in Daddy was in 23. Thelma was born in 1925, and then John Kenneth was born in 1927. Grandpa Pike was born in 1885 in Illinois, but his family went to Nebraska by the late 1880s and lived in Stromsburg area. He went to the University of Nebraska and did not graduate. April before his senior year was over, he decided he wanted to leave college and get a job before all the other engineers and surveyors and everybody else got out with degrees, and a degree wasn't that important at that time. Before he came to Texas, one of his jobs before graduation, he laid out the little town of Polk, Nebraska, surveyed it, and got it set up. And once that was finished, he heard that there was a job in San Antonio, and so he came to San Antonio. They were laying out the trolley tracks up and down Broadway, and the track that he laid across Broadway by the old San Antonio Museum of Art Pearl Brewery is part of the tracks that are still left that he surveyed to lay out. Grandpa had met Edith. About that time, troubles were brewing in Mexico with the revolution, and Pancho Villa had come across and raided the community of Columbus, New Mexico. And the President of the United States sent a military contingent from Nebraska to Deming, New Mexico, to the fort there. Jim was helping to set up the tents and the camps for the military from Nebraska and decided he'd make some money on the side. Well, he called Edith, his girlfriend at the University of Nebraska. Edith was born in Nebraska, eastern Nebraska, went to university and was so proud of the fact that she was among the first women to be graduated from the University of Nebraska's School of Agriculture. This was the first year they had a School of Home Economics, of which she majored in, and stayed around for a couple of years to teach there while her boyfriend was off running around and making enough money to pay for their wedding and the first years of any marriage they had. She was a very practical woman. She came down, they got married in El Paso, and then he took her to Deming, New Mexico. They set up a little, they cleaned clothes there. They had a little store, little restaurant, short order, and they called it, hold your breath, the Cornhusker. When the trials and tribulations of the Pancho Villa visit were over, he was reassigned to Fort Bliss, and then my mom and aunt were born there, 1921 and 1923. By 24, he had been reassigned to San Antonio and Fort Sam Houston, where he had an office in the quadrangle, where they had lived for decades into the 1940s and 50s. And that's where Mom grew up. She went to and graduated from Incarnate Word College, and during her senior year of learning to be a teacher, she taught out at Somerset Elementary School. And that's where she saw these big old boys running around with the little bitty elementary school kids playing softball with them. When the little kids would get up to bat and they would bunt it or barely get it past the pitcher, well, one of the big football boys would pick them up, put them on their shoulder, and run to first base, and somebody would run to second base with their little kids. And those were the children that Mother was teaching, the little ones, in second grade. And she just thought those big old football boys were just angels. She didn't know who they were yet, and that she'd end up marrying one in a couple of years. But she was introduced to the people and the culture at Somerset in 41. Dad was born at Old Somerset in northern Atascosa County, at the end of what used to be called James Road. It's now South Kenny or something like that. On January 8, 1923. His mom was Clara Muriel McCoy James, born in 1900. And she married Grandpa, oh jeepers, he had a reputation, Jesse Garfield James, who was born in 1897. Dad was the oldest child. He was big for his age. By the time he was 6 or 7 years old, he was almost as tall as his dad, who was 5'6", 5'7". At age of 9, Grandpa had him as the camp cook for the hunting expeditions that Grandpa had down on Old Man Witherspoon's ranch. And Daddy would go down there and work the Dutch ovens and clean up the camps and do whatever needed to be doing when he was 9, 10, 11 years old. The Nueces had one of the worst floods it ever has had. And the camp where they were located, the hunting camp, was on a high area, but the river came up and came all through the camp, swept most of the camp away except for his tent and a couple of the sleeping cots that were on it. So he was on the cot, but the tent was full of water. And he and a possum got in the same tent, and in the week to 10 days that it took for that river to continue flooding and then subside, Daddy got to eat the possum. And he had learned to do this from a lady called, all I know of is Mrs. Barnes, who lived down in the end of the road, James Road, on one of the ranches that led down into the Blackjacks. A few years ago, I discovered that she was a black lady, and she and her husband lived there. And his dad would go down into the Blackjacks to get cows that he had dropped off as a little kid. When he was 6, 7, 8 years old, that was his job. Get on your horse Dixie, take the cows for the few weeks or months down in the Blackjacks, and then go get them and bring them back home alone. This would probably be in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 miles. And then on the way back home, well, he would stop and water his horse Dixie at Miss Barnes' place, and Miss Barnes, if she was fixing something, would have him for lunch or supper. Yeah. One of the meals was possum that she had given him. And they would laugh about it, so when it came time to decide whether or not to eat that possum, that's what he knew how to do it. Yes, one of the things Dad told me was how easy it was to get water when you were down in the Blackjacks. And as we would visit his uncle Robert McCoy and his wife Ruby, Dad would show me, he said, well, this is what you do. You just get down and you just start digging. And I, as a 4 or 5 year old in the late 40s, I would dig down as far as my little arm could reach. And then we'd go and visit the relatives for 3 or 4 hours and come back, and there would be water in the bottom of that I could drink. So I learned that, yeah, on the way down into the Blackjacks, he would dig a hole for him and one for Dixie, his horse, and then on the way back he could have water, fresh water. And that's what Atascosa means. It means a boggy place where the water is close to the surface. So I didn't know that until just a couple of years ago. Grandpa was an interesting character who was alternately working for the oil companies out there, especially the Slimp, hauling for oil for the Slimp Oil Company, working for Old Man Witherspoon. He worked on his ranch, both looking over the oil interests and then acting as a foreman for the ranch.
Where was the ranch?
Down on the Nueces River in the Three Rivers area generally, probably west of Three Rivers. I'm not really sure. Yes. My grandfather had friends among some of the most interesting people in Bexar County. There was V.E. Red Berry, who ran the cockfights and the gambling in the southeast part of San Antonio. And then his running buddy, a guy by the name of Skeeter Klaus, that operated the cockfights and the gambling in South and Southwest Bexar County. Grandpa met them, and Skeeter Klaus used to come out to the house fairly regularly, and they'd talk cockfighting or whatever else. I have no idea what those two outlaws, in the truest sense of the word, did. But one day they were talking cockfighting, and Skeeter Klaus was saying that there was did he want to go to Oklahoma to a cockfight up there? And he said, yeah. He said, I've got some of the best cocks around here. He said, grab that old rooster over there. And Dad said, I was standing nearby petting my white duck. And he said, Dad grabbed the duck out of my hand and said, here, come on, let's pit these two. And so he was poking the duck at the chicken to get them to peck one another. And he said, Skeeter Klaus started laughing, and he said, Jess, you don't know what you're getting into. And he said, what do you mean? He said, my rooster will just make feathers of this duck. And he said, nope. He said, well, I learned up in Oklahoma the last time I was there. He said, a guy brought out his Muscovy duck, and a lot of people said, got my rooster here. And he said, we'll just make sure that you don't have a duck left at the end of the fight. And he said they pitted the two, and the duck started slapping with the feathers, with his wings, and pecking. And he said, kill the chicken. He said, never bet against a duck in a cockfight. And I've thought about that since then, oftentimes, and I think those are words of wisdom. Be careful who you're getting into a fight with. This was in the 20s and the 30s during the Depression. So he got jobs where he could, and one of the jobs was with the Bexar County Sheriff's Department. He was a deputy sheriff, a jail guard. And that seemed to open it up to opportunities for moving his moonshine from the Blackjacks, where he brewed peach brandy and all kinds of other goodies. And folks have told me that he put the booze in an old army truck and would drive it to Bexar County Courthouse, back up to the loading dock, and then sell it to the judges and the clerks and anybody else who wanted to buy his homebrew. This would be in the late early 30s to mid 30s. In 36, as a jail guard, he probably got an offer that was too good to refuse. He ended up serving a year and a half of a 2-year prison at the Walker unit in Huntsville because he was guilty of auto theft. People would steal cars or trucks in San Antonio, drive them to Seguin. Somebody would pick them up in Seguin, drive them someplace else, and then they'd end up at a barn up in the back of the house there at Somerset, the corner of 2790 and what used to be James Road. Then somebody else would pick it up and take it to wherever else the next destination was. And so Grandpa never knew that it was there. Grandmother did, though, and one day she had to get some new canning lids because she was in the process of canning for winter, all the good produce that was grown in her garden. She went into town thinking that the vehicle that was in the garage up at the hill, on the side of the hill up in the pasture, was one of her husband's cars, and it wasn't, and it was a stolen vehicle, and she was arrested for vehicle theft. And it didn't take long before Grandpa swore up and down that it was he that was involved in this and not his wife. So he got to spend 1.5 years at the Walker unit in Huntsville. She had always had a huge garden and fruit trees. But there had been a drought partly during this time of the 30s and so forth. And so she didn't have as much of that, but she had turkeys, and she sold turkeys at Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I'm sure she took in canning for other people, but I found out from a lot of people that people in Somerset took care of Grandma too, because she had taken care of others. And they would have baskets of food left on the front porch and boxes of something or other left on the front porch. And so she still canned, made sure that there were meats canned, vegetables canned, fruits canned, so that they could have the food, whatever was given in season, so that she could take care of that. And then that was her job, is to keep the house running. During the trial down at the Bexar County Courthouse, the judge took Dad. Dad was 13 at the time, late 13s, and told him to go downstairs and to get his commercial driver's license. Mr. Witherspoon and Mr. Kurtz and some others had come down to the court to stand by my grandmother and family. There were others there too, but they had convinced the judge that they could put Daddy to work at a meaningful job, that he could handle it. He was a big kid. He was as 15-year-old, he was almost 6 feet tall. He's a big boy. Stood about a head above most of the kids as a youngster. So he got his commercial driver's license. He had to quit school. Dad could drive trucks, tractors, had looked at a few mules in the rear, plowing peanuts and everything else. So he was no stranger to hard work. So he started hauling oil from a truck and got an oil tank to put on it, because the Slimp Oil Company said, if you, and Mr. Witherspoon, if you go check and get oil from Mr. Witherspoon's wells and other wells and then deliver it, he said, then you can make money on deliveries. So all across Christine, Dilley, all across South Texas to the Somerset Pioneer refinery, and on into San Antonio to Pioneer's refinery there on the east side of San Antonio. He became the youngest person in the state of Texas to be authorized by the Texas Railroad Commission to sign railroad documents, and had a very responsible job picking up crude oil, delivering it to refineries or to the railheads for delivery to wherever the railroads was taking it. One of the things Dad learned pretty fast was that he could make more money if he drove the truck, his oil truck, 24/7. So he hired 2 guys, and that way he could sleep and the other guy could eat, and while the third guy was hauling oil. That lasted about 1 year, and he had to buy a new truck. So he ended up as a 14, 15, about 16-year-old. Let's see, I guess he was 14, early 14 when we started, and he had just turned 16 when he didn't have to work anymore. So he did that for 2 years after Grandpa spent a year and a half out of 2 year time at the Walker unit at Huntsville. Grandpa got work again with Mr. Witherspoon, and in 1940 I noticed when I was going through U.S. Census records, Grandpa was, in 1 week he was at home at Somerset, and in the same census record, but for down at Dilley area, he was on the census record down there working as an oil driller. So he was a farmer in one and an oil driller in the other, working for Mr. Witherspoon. So he had a job there that kept him somewhat busy. Dad worked a little while longer until Grandpa got back on his feet with Mr. Witherspoon and whatever. And that's when the coach came to talk to him, football coach, basketball coach, baseball coach. He was the coach at Somerset. To me, the guy walks on water. So it didn't take long before other people convinced Dad, get back to school. You might be 2 grades behind, but you need to graduate, and just don't worry about it. And in 40, Grandpa got out in 39, and by 40 he was back in and graduated in June of 1942. He graduated with his sister, his baby sister, who was 2 years younger than he was. There had been a football game down in Jourdanton, I think, and Mother had driven down with a fellow teacher who owned a car. So the 2 ladies went down to enjoy the football doings down in Jourdanton. Dad, on the football team during the game, had gotten his collarbone broken. And the doctor who was attending there, I don't know if he was local or if he was with the team, but he said that Jess needed to go home. So the mom's teacher friend volunteered to take Dad home. And so the 2 ladies got Jessie loaded up in the back seat and then drove the bouncy, rough road back to Somerset and delivered him to the house. And I just can't imagine having a broken collarbone, having to ride all that way in the back seat of a bouncing car, and then another day or 2 before you get to see the doctor and have your collarbone set. Mercy. The football team thought the 2nd grade teacher, Miss June Pike, was just the cutest, sweetest thing that ever was. They decided that when they graduated, they put in $1 in a pot, and whoever was the first one to ask her out and get accepted would win the pot. Well, upon graduation, Dad asked Miss Pike out, and she accepted, and so he won the pot. And a couple of months later, he married her down in Jourdanton on August 8th, 1942.
What really happened?
My mother said the superintendent had talked to my aunt and dad individually behind closed doors for some reason. Don't know what was said, don't know what they were talked about. But Dad had football practice or athletic practice after school, so the superintendent brought Thelma home. Mother said, because she was teaching school at the time, and one of the other teachers said something about, don't tell anybody, but Thelma was behind closed doors with the superintendent. And somebody else said, well, don't ever let Jessie Garfield know that the superintendent took Thelma home. Mother said one of the other teachers said that Jesse and Thelma had been in town and had seen the superintendent was the lady that wasn't his wife. Whatever that was, have no idea, but that was what was said. And so behind closed doors, both of the kids were talked to, whatever was said, and that was it. And I only heard about this about 14 years ago, just a couple of years before Mom and Dad passed away. Mom said, I guess I ought to get it off my chest, or something, so that people know, so you know what went on. She didn't think I'd be sharing it with the world. She said that the superintendent and the school board president were best friends, and she said that what she had heard was that Jesse had been shot and had made it home and had died at home, falling off his horse.
Shot by
the president of the school board. This happened about 3/4 of a mile from the house at the corner, southwest corner of Benton City Road, where it joins Briggs Road and turns and goes up past the Catholic church and cemetery to join 2790, the road between Somerset and Lytle. He was riding a horse. He had been visiting with one of the neighbors that lived, the Mexican guy that lived on that corner. That's all I knew about it. And in 2016, I got on fold3.com, my home away from home on the internet, for birth and death records and military records. And I found Grandpa's death certificate. I thought, well, this is interesting. Didn't know anything about it. It said that he died of a gunshot wound, exsanguination, at home. And I asked Mom, I said, Mom, I had seen something about it. And she said, I heard that he had pulled a knife on the school board president, and the school board president shot him. And she said, but it's funny. She said, the only knife I ever saw that man carry was a little 1.5 inch pocket knife that he carried in his watch pocket that he cleaned his fingernails with. He said he didn't even have, it wasn't a very big knife at all. He said he was pulling a knife. It wasn't one to mean business with. So that's all I ever knew. Then in 2016, 17, I got to going through old newspapers, and I could not find, I thought, well, I have this death certificate. I'll just look and see what went on in the newspapers. Could not find a thing in the Express or the Light. And I thought, well, I'll look in La Prensa, the Spanish speaking, and there it was. There was an article of how Jesse Garfield was visiting with this neighbor, and the school board president, Mr. Leonard, George Leonard, pulled up in his car, saying that he wanted to talk to his Mexican gentleman about getting a job at the school district. And he said before he could do anything that Jesse pulled a knife on him, and he said in self-defense, or I shot him. And he said that at one point there was a question as to whether he was on a horse or off the horse. And I've heard to this day somebody say that he fell off there and died there. And the La Prensa said that he was on a horse and he had left. And then I got to looking at the death certificate, and the death certificate reads that he was shot in the back of the shoulder and on the left side twice.
in the back.
In the back. Grandpa was shot at a home that was on the southeast corner of where Briggs Road and Benton City Road meet. This is the house where the Jameses were living at the time, in the old house. And this is where Jesse Garfield made it back home, and this is where he died. He had been visiting this fellow, Mexican fellow, here, and were having a conversation, whatever it was, when the superintendent's friend, the president of the school board, drove up to give this guy a job. And according to La Prensa newspaper, Jesse pulled a knife on the school board president, and the school board president shot him. And then he went home down this road, down Benton City Road, to the house where he died. He made it all the way back home. So the interesting stories that are going around, I've heard that it happened in downtown Somerset. I've heard one story I heard, and this has all been in the last 3 or 4 years. It's been so interesting. Another one he was on the road from Somerset to Lytle, Mr. Leonard in his car, and Jesse stopped him and pulled out his pistol to have Mr. Leonard get out, and told him, he said, "I want you to dance." And he started shooting at Mr. Leonard's feet, and Mr. Leonard pulled out a shotgun and blasted Jesse and shot him to death right in the middle of the road. Yes, I've heard that it happened in the coal mine, and that's where his body lay. Then I've heard it happened in downtown Somerset. To me, it's interesting. It's just, I don't want to glorify Grandpa by any stretch of the imagination. He was, a mean son of a bitch. And I told somebody not too long ago, I said about our county sheriff, who was having great difficulty, and it's with some of his jail guards and deputies, and it seemed like every week he was having to fire one. And I got to thinking, if they were like my grandpa, I could appreciate what that poor sheriff from Bexar County was having to put up with, and I appreciated getting rid of him before they caused him even more headaches and heartaches. So Grandpa was an interesting character, but he lived for his times, through the Depression, through all kinds of interesting times. As the West was becoming more modern, and he was a child of his times out in the country. My dad, Jesse Columbus James, came home from the war by November 1945. I was born in 46 in March. Okay, I've got 2 brothers. Tim James was an electrician, union electrician. My brother Mike James, he was the estimator that got them all the jobs and kept them in business for 40 years. He's still working. Daddy worked for his brother-in-law, Calvin Wilhelm, for the Wilhelm Ice Company. And one of the jobs he had was delivering blocks of ice to homes on the west side, south and west side of San Antonio, to put ice in their ice boxes. We did not have refrigerators back then. And he would drive the ice truck home to our home on the Velker farm and ranch, just on the north side of San Antonio. And as a little toddler, when I could get over to the truck, it was fascinating because it was cool in the summertime. And if Daddy was around, I could get him to lift me up and put on the cool bed of the truck and crawl under the big tarp where all the ice was, and then just get so cold. It was so much fun. Well, he got a better job with the U.S. Post Office. And as a person that picked up the mail at the rail stations, carried it to the main post office, would take whatever needed to go out on the next train to one of the other stations, would also drive out to the airport late at night when the last airlines were coming in to pick up the mail, real air mail back then, for taking it downtown to be sorted and delivered the next morning or two to homes around San Antonio. Well, Mother would pack us. My little brother Mike was an infant, so he was born in July, so probably in the fall of 48, She would take us in our brand new 48 Mercury out to the San Antonio airport. I wish you all could have seen it then. It was one little tiny building that wasn't any bigger than this house. And we would park alongside the road and wait for Daddy to come by in his mail truck. And as soon as about 11:30 at night, he would drive by and honk because he could recognize the car. And we would follow him to the terminal. And it was pretty much closed down, but there would probably be somebody cleaning the floor, and they would let him in to let us see what the terminal looked like late at night when nobody was there working. Like I said, you should have been there. Then he would take us over to where he worked. It was, probably 50 yards or maybe not that far from the terminal to the north and west side of it. And it was a little tiny, probably 10 foot by 8 foot little hut. As you walked in the door that was on one side of the building, there would be like a draft table up against the wall, and that's where he would fill out his information. Any mail that was going out, he would have in the truck, and it was parked nearby. When the last airplanes came in, they would be unloading their mail sacks and leaving them in the far corner. Whoever was there would lock it up, and then Daddy's job was to take all of that mail, put it in his truck, and then haul it down to the main post office about midnight or 1 o'clock. One of the airplanes that was usually the last to arrive was an Eastern airline flight, and maybe once a month, Dad said that Eddie would come in on it. And I had no idea who Eddie was, and he was talking to Mom one night and said, yeah, he said, Eddie and Eddie's driver comes in with the limousine, and he said, we sit around here, we pull up chairs, and we sit here and talk sometimes for 30 minutes or an hour. And then they decide they better get going because it's getting on early in the morning, and they've got to head to the ranch up on the other side of Kerrville. And the driver had been driving long hours, and so he was getting tired. And Eddie had flown in, so he was getting tired. But we always had the leftover coffee and the leftover sandwiches that didn't get eaten, so we polished those off. And we'd sit there till the sandwiches were gone and tell stories of all kinds. And he said, I never thought about Eddie being anybody special. I knew who Eddie Rickenbacker was, but he was just a real down-to-earth guy. He said, I enjoyed the many visits we had in the evening, late at night, before I got out of the post office business and went to work. And then I remember reading about Eddie donating part of his ranch to the Boy Scouts at Bear Creek. And he said, I was just so proud of what Eddie had done. The next job Dad had was to be a post office mechanic. They paid more. The hours were more regular. And so from about 1952 or 53, Dad got to be a mechanic. Mother stayed home with us. We had moved to a new home in Castle Hills that we had built for us, where the bank is now, in 1953 when it was finished. Or 52, I'm sorry, 52 to 53 when it was finished. And Dad and Mother decided by 1958 that the kids were getting old enough. We were all in school, heading to first grade, my little baby brother, who was born in 1952. And if Mother wanted to go back to teaching, she could. Mama June James, at one point, went from a couple of years at Hoopert's Elementary School to teaching science, physical science, at Longfellow Junior High School. And it was at Longfellow that she started working on a master's degree and did some interesting work. I was starting college myself, on motivating the educationally uninvolved student. So she specialized in kids that didn't want to be in school and weren't the gifted and talented type. She eventually went to MacArthur High School, where she also taught physical science. And she and the administrators, one of whom was the mother of a couple of kids I had at Roosevelt, who was just a wonderful lady, made sure they knew that Mother had the kids she wanted, the kids that nobody else wanted, and that's who Mother taught. Mother would have strategies like she was always at the door to make sure every child that came in the door, she shook their hands, touched their elbow, touched them, unless she knew, and the ones that had difficulty with that, touched their shoulder, let them know that she knew that they were there. Occasionally, she said she came in one day and or I came in one day to visit with her at home, and she said, had an interesting day today. She said nobody wanted to do what we were going to be doing, and she said, so I told them, I said, just put your heads down. I said, y'all can go to sleep. So I'm going to do the experiment up here at my desk. And she said, I started taking this beautiful, I can't think of what it's called right now, I'll think of it in a minute, beautiful blue liquid, and stirring it up and doing something else and making little noises and pouring this and pouring that, and something would do something else to it. And she said, I'd noticed kids looking up and said, put your head down. You're not supposed to, just put your head down. And one little kid, she said, finally raised his head, and she said, or he said, you told us one time that we could be easily cheated, didn't you? And she said, yes, I did. And he said, are you trying to cheat us out of an education? And she said, oh, really? Okay, let's get started on the lesson. So they got to participate in the lesson. But that's how she worked with kiddos that did not want an education. What did we do as kids? We climbed trees. In Castle Hills, each of us had a big oak tree that we could climb, and don't let anybody else climb that tree but us. It was our tree. We also had dogs, a dog that we could play with, and so the dogs were usually outside, but sometimes we'd bring them in. And Daddy brought home a cat one time that we called Mittens, and Mittens was the indoor, well, it was supposed to be an outdoor cat because Daddy said cats belonged out in the barn. But that cat would go to the back door and start twitching its tail and meowing, and that meant let me in now. He would go park himself on Dad's chair in the living room, and if Dad was sitting in his chair, then Mike and Tim and I would be kind of watchful to see, okay, what's Dad going to do? What's he going to do? And Daddy would probably get up and go fix something in the kitchen because Daddy was handy in the kitchen, and the cat would take over the chair. So we all grew up with this, with animals in the house and creatures. Tim always had a blanket that he carried that he would put the cat in, and he and the cat went everywhere. Mike had a dog, a little collie for a time, and wherever he was bicycle riding, the dog was there too. We all went to Castle Hills Elementary School. From there, we went, Robert E. Lee Junior High School came into being, and then it became Nimitz Junior High School. Michael went there, and then I was at the junior high school and high school at Robert E. Lee. And little brother Tim, Churchill was built, and so he graduated, went to Eisenhower junior high school and graduated from Churchill. He was active with the coaches. They would give him the keys to the locker room, and as the trainer, then he could come and go to get equipment ready for all the different activities. Fill up the soda machines, rob the soda machines, count out the cash. And I often wondered, what in the world did the coaches ever do? But Tim loved it, and when his first job out of high school was working for a sporting uniform and equipment repair place that was out there nearby, and worked there for a couple of years before he got into electrician work and went to school to get his certification to be a union electrician. We were a hunting family. When my brother Mike got to be 9 years old, Dad and his brother Kenneth, who had young sons also, and one of the other fellows they worked with at the post office garage, all of them were mechanics, decided their kids needed to know how to hunt. So they got a lease on Mr. Edwards' ranch at Pipe Creek. And we spent 2 or 3 years up there. We had year-round privileges, so we could, Mother would take us on hikes up to the top of the hill that had a geological survey marker up there. And coming back down the hill was fun, and then we'd get the blinds or the boards in the tree built so that the people could have a place to hunt. And come November 1st or weekend, then Daddy and Mike would be out with the other guys. Mike would be bringing home his first deer somewhere about, probably late 60s or mid 60s. Daddy would also take me hunting. I'd take a day off from school when we weren't doing anything and dress real warmly. I'd have his 30-30, and he would put me out underneath a cedar tree on the ground, and I'd sit there and freeze my feet off and wait for a deer to come by, but I never saw one. But I got to see, like Daddy would say, there's the foxes out there, there's the birds, there's all kinds of things to see. And so maybe that's what got me into eventually teaching hunter education too. So Daddy raised a bunch of hunters. I went to high school at Robert E. Lee High School. Once I got into after my junior year, Mom told me that if I made straight A's, that she would let me take flying lessons or buy me a horse, whatever I wanted. But I couldn't have both. So I decided I wanted a horse just really badly, after all the stories that I'd heard about Dad and Dixie and all the other horses. And Mom and I went to a couple of places and looked at some Appaloosas and looked at some other fairly nice horses that were between $5,000 and $10,000 a horse, and we couldn't afford that. And went to a place out north of the airport a ways, and it was a riding stable that had an arena. And he had 2 horses, one a King Ranch horse that was really a dud, and the other one, this buckskin, he said that people rode all the time. So he saddled up the horse, bridled it, and I had ridden the deadhead the day before. And when I got on George, that's what I called him when I got him home, he started crow hopping after I kicked him in the side, because I figured he was just as bad as the other one. And he started crow hopping down the length of the little arena. And I finally got him pulled one rein so I could pull him into the fence and get him turned around, and then was able to get him back with a very collected trot back to the boss. And I told Dad, I said, this is the one I want. And Dad said, okay. He said, we'll get him home. And he said, once we got home, he said, I hope you understand that you nearly scared that guy to death when that horse started bucking with you. He said he thought you were off, and I said, well, I thought I was too, but I just stayed with it, and we came to an understanding. And I think that's how George and I, for the next, let's see, he was 6 years old, so the next 25 years, he was about 30 when he died, and he was the family horse, and took me all over the place. And one of the people I met was a little young lady. She was in junior high school when I was a senior. Her name was Valerie Slimp. And I got home and told Dad one day, I said, I just met a young lady named Valerie Slimp. And he said, is her dad's name Beverly? And so I went, asked her. She said, yes. And come to find out, that was Chester Slimp's son, Beverly, that used to drive trucks with Dad. And Chester owned the Slimp Oil Company, Pioneer Refining out at Somerset, and Dad knew him as well as he did anybody in the business world. And I got to thinking that when I finally met Chester, he was just tickled to death that Daddy was my dad. And I got to be the friend to Valerie. And her dad would give me the keys to the car, and you all go to a horse show, or would you go buy her, or give me the checkbook, or we didn't have credit cards in that time, so that she could write a check for her junior senior prom dress. And so I got to know this family and Valerie like a sister. And one morning, before Christmas, my senior year, it was the last day of school before Christmas break. I got a phone call about 7 o'clock in the morning from Mrs. Slimp. She said, I have to tell you this. Valerie died last night. And she said she had picked up this stray horse, and it started running and pulled her into a telephone pole not far from the house, and it crushed in her skull, and she died at the hospital. So that was my first death of a friend, and I will tell you, I've really not gotten over it. She was the precious child, good friend, love of her daddy and mom, and big brother Bryant, who lives in Houston. Dad became a vehicle maintenance supervisor to hire and fire mechanics. One of Dad's friends at the post office garage was a mechanic named Levy Taylor. Levy lived on the east side and was involved in youth sports over there. He was, from time to time, a basketball coach, a football coach, referee for both events. In the 40s, I don't know how early, he was also in the Negro Texas baseball leagues, and had several guys on a team that would travel on weekends across Texas to play baseball. I got to talking to Dad about it one time. I don't recall how, and he said, yeah, he said, well, for example, he said, Levy last weekend had to drive to Dallas with his teammates, loaded in the car, and he said they had to make sure they ate and took sandwiches with them, then played a game and had to drive straight back home again. And I thought, whoa. 5 or 6 hours by I-35, and this was before I-35, taking Highway 181 and so forth. It's probably going to be 10 hours. And then you play baseball hard, and then you have to drive back home. Well, where did they stop for gas? He said they took cans of gas. They could not stop at a restaurant because no restaurant would take in black customers. He said there was even a sign outside of Waco, Bell County, that told them they couldn't come through or didn't want them through. And I said, okay. So he got to telling me about Levy, and Then one night earlier we had gone to a game at San Pedro Park, south side of the park, across from what used to be an ice skating rink, and then the bus people bought it. And we sat in the car, the 48 Ford, not Ford, sorry, with 53 Ford is what we had, but the 48 Mercury. And I wanted to get outside and go play in the grass while Mom and Dad watched the baseball game that was going on. And he said, no, just stay where you are. So I sat in the back seat and watched people playing baseball. And when it was all over with, we drove home. Well, the next weekend, we'd show up at San Pedro Park if the game was going on, and we'd sit there, and I'd sit in the back seat and try to be quiet, but I'd be watching what was going on. And maybe the next weekend we wouldn't be there, and maybe a month later we'd be at the baseball game. Well, that went on for a couple of years, and it just never dawned on me until I was an adult. And I knew who Levy Taylor was, one of Dad's friends that had passed away. And Dad and two others who worked at the post office garage were asked to be Levy's pallbearers. And Dad came home from the event and said, well, we had an interesting to-do. He said, we got out of the cars and we're walking up the steps to the church. I think it was Second Baptist Church over on the east side. And he said there were 5 or 6 of Levy's friends that were waiting and wanted to know why we were there, that this was not a white man's event. And he said, about that time, Mrs. Taylor came out and told him, these are Levy's friends at work. They are pallbearers, and you leave them alone. So she escorted us in to sit down and honor Levy, which we did. Took care of him till he was buried, and we all came home. And it dawned on me a couple of years ago that was his friend from the east side and his buddies playing baseball there at San Pedro Park. One of the things I remember about Levy Taylor, and then I'd have to get their names up. I just knew them as a kid as Nacho and Mano, some of the guys that worked with Dad at the post office. And every year at Christmas time, we shared inexpensive presents. Mano's wife would make us all kinds of good Christmas sweets to enjoy. And we would send things over. Oh, and tamales. Oh, my God, the tamales. And then we would send things over to them that Mom would make, a pecan pie, or what she learned also to make a frijole pie that came out looking like a pecan pie, that she made one for each of them. So the 3 pies went out to the east side and south side and west side. And life was good. About 1967, Mom and Dad wanted to move out into the country and found 5 acres out at Leon Springs off Bernie Stage Road, and built a beautiful house out there. That's where my wedding reception was held. And it had just been finished. It didn't have a lot of anything but beds and a dining room table in it. But one of the things Dad liked to do that Mom laughed about, she said he's always a farmer at heart. The people who owned the property left a little red barn that had a Gravely tractor in it, that had a tiller, and that he could till up a garden, which he did, and a big 40-inch grass cutting equipment that he cut the 5 acres of grass with. And it was like watching him go out on the tractor in the morning and coming back just like he did as a kid. And then gradually he had lost hearing, but she bought him some of the top of the line hearing aids that cost $700. This was in early 90s. late 80s, early 90s. And Daddy would come in and she'd say, Jesse, I'm trying to talk to you. Where's your hearing aids? Oh, and he'd pull them out of his pocket and he'd stick one in, stick the other, and she'd say, no, it's the other way around, Jesse. You put the left one in your right ear and your right ear. When Mom and Dad moved out to Leon Springs, Mother, being the good Presbyterian that she was, attended the Leon Springs Presbyterian Church, sang in the choir, as she had done at her previous church. She also taught Sunday school, eventually got put on the diaconate, and then over time, as she grew a little bit older and wiser, she made it to as a teaching elder and on the session. Daddy, on the other hand, if he went to Sunday school as a child, I never heard anybody talk about it. But when they moved out to Leon Springs, Daddy had his Gravely tractor, and whoever had been cutting the grass at the church had either passed away or moved away, but was there no longer. And Mother came home and said, we got to find somebody to cut the grass. Do you think that somebody next door neighbor who she could see cut grass? I think this was Mother's strategy. Do you think the neighbor would be interested in cutting the church grass? And Daddy said, well, I can cut it. So he would load up the tractor every previous Saturday before church service and go down there and cut the grass, bake cookies for the next morning so that people after church, after Sunday school and before church, even after church, would have enough cookies for their coffee and visit. Well, this went on for 5 or 6 years, maybe even 10 years, and somebody said something about, Jesse, are you baptized? And Daddy said, well, I don't know. He really didn't know. And so he said, well, would you be interested in joining our church and being baptized? And he said, well, let me think about it. So he went home and he and Mom talked about it. And within the month, he was a baptized and communicating communicant with the Leon Springs Presbyterian Church. We'd be sitting on the porch in the evening or around the dinner table, or we'd be doing something. Well, that reminds me when I was a kid and we would be playing, in Cowboys and Indians and Dob and Bill and so-and-so and so-and-so, and we'd all get on our horses and get one of the wagons and run across the field and, chase each other on horseback. And I used to think that was just the most fun on the planet. Just all the kids in the neighborhood played, and I'd hear that when I was a kid. And then as we grow up, it would go older, it would be just other stories that would happen when some of the relatives would stop by. This is where the old Tom Kenny store, the James New house, the James Old house where Dr. Matthew's store was. There was another store across the road. There was the Methodist church was in through here someplace. There was a blacksmith shop and then a well. There was another well, very famous well, down the road here, and it's in a low place that you can still see. The Kenny brothers, the other brother, had a store right here. Let's see, there was a cotton gin right in through here. That was Tom and Jim Kenny. I'll have to get my Kennys straight. In through here is the St. Pat's Cemetery. It's where the original St. Patrick's Church was, that was finally torn down about 1953. And I did get to spend 3 Sundays there with my McCoy cousins, listening to Mass. Let's see. There was a store here that was probably the La Colorada that everybody knew. It was also a cantina, and then a lot of people were living around here. that worked in the mines. There were several things fun about that old Dr. Matthews house that the Jameses lived in since about 1925, 26, until they all moved away from home. And then Clara had a new house built for her about 1951, 52. One of the interesting parts was the old outhouse. Daddy showed me where there was a knothole on the north side that he hammered a nail into. And when you got tired of just sitting there looking through the catalog, that was the toilet paper, then you could pull the knothole out, and then you could take a peek to see, well, who was coming down the road, or who was, what was going on outside, and then put it back in. It was just something to do, but it was fun. And as a kid, I just loved it. But Dad had built it in the 40s. He had gotten the kit from the lumber yard and then took it home and put it together. So it was a big deal. And then the knothole made it even more fun. But Grandma's house was old. The front porch you had to watch out for. There's a story of how one of the traveling salesmen had two suitcases too heavy, and when he stepped on the porch, he fell through and left the suitcases up about shoulder high. Anyway, and then the back porch was where Grandmother slept. And anybody who came to the house started hollering Clara long before they got there, because she always slept with her .22 pistol. And she wasn't going to get snuck up onto. The other thing that was fun was just inside the front door on the east side was where the boys slept. And they had the old Bexar School blackboard behind the headboards of their beds. So if they could find chalk somewhere, they could send messages or draw pictures. And I got to do that once or twice, and that was fun as a kid. But that was Grandma's old house. I'm just so, in retrospect, I'm just so proud, pleased, not just proud, but pleased that I got to see that old house and be a part of that old James family just on a couple of occasions. Daddy would take my brothers out to get their haircuts when they were little kids. And they'd talk about, well, do you remember when so-and-so not only had the hand clippers, but he decided that he'd get wild with the horse and mule clippers that they had. And anyway, just all kinds of stories. And Mother would start to, we need to write these down, and he would just climb up. So about in the late 90s, early 2000s, Mom and I decided it's going to happen. Daddy was still the farmer, but Daddy loved to cook. And Daddy got to where he, for about 30 years, baked cookies for the Leon Springs Presbyterian Church for the Sunday morning get together after church and for Vacation Bible School. It wouldn't take much. If it wasn't oatmeal cookies, was another one, but they got to where they liked his oatmeal cookies, and so you could depend on that. You could also depend on Saturday afternoon with hot oatmeal cookies coming out of the oven that the Presbyterian minister would stop by and present his sermon to Mom, and they would be arguing over the theology and philosophy and verbiage of his sermon as they ate warm oatmeal cookies. There would be another church family group that would come in, and we'd be 8 to 10 to 12 people sitting around this big table eating Daddy's warm cookies, and he'd mix up another batch so he'd have some ready for Sunday. And then he'd be telling stories on the side to whoever was listening, and Mother would get the pastor to stop, and she'd start writing real fast about what was going on. And since I'd heard the stories before, then I would take all the notes home and I would transcribe them and put them into a Word document. This is what we put together. There is a different volume that's about three times as thick as this one with all the stories. And then I've got them on here on a thumb drive, and I think I'm going to have to print up some more and let at least have a copy for the Historical Society to have in their resources. Okay, Mom and Dad passed away in March and then December of 2008. And in 2009, we put the property up for sale. One of our friends, mother's friends that lives out there in Stagecoach Hills, saw me one time and she said, "I've just got to tell you this, Peggy." She said, "One of my friends that I've recommended," she said, was working with this lady that was looking, or this family that was looking for a house out in Stagecoach Hills. And the realtor took her up to this brand new house that had just been finished. And then she took her down to Mom and Dad's house. And the realtor was talking to me after this showing, and she said, "I don't know what's going on." She said, "But the family that they were showing the house to at the top of the hill were talking about how cold it was in there. They were just freezing and wanted to. It was almost summertime." And she said there wasn't any air conditioning on at the time, that they were just really, really cold. And she said, "I just didn't think anything of it." And we went down the hill to your mom and dad to show your mom and dad's house. And they walked in, and she said, immediately they said, "What peace. This is the most comforting house that they've ever been in." She said, "I couldn't tell you why. But all of a sudden," she said, "I just had this comforting feeling all over." These two were the most loving couple. Daddy's smile at Mother and her smile at his all the time. Even when they were frustrated, there was a togetherness that you don't see in a lot of people. And they were made for each other, and I know they're up there tapping me on the shoulder every once in a while to make sure I get back out to Somerset to do what needs doing. So thank you all up there. We had Mom in hospice care for 3 or 4 days before her passing, and all of us were gathered, went over and helped Dad sit next to Mom and hold Mom's hand. So we all went down the hall to get a cup of coffee, and we went back to the room, and Jesse was still holding Mom's hand and smiling as we walked in. And we asked, "Well, are you okay?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what, is Mom okay?" He said, "Yeah, she's gone." She said, "I told her I loved her. I told her I'd be okay. It was okay for her to go." And she smiled at me, and then she was gone. 9 months later, Daddy just wasted away, and we were able to tell him the same thing. "It's okay. We love you. Tell Mom hi for us." And he died at home with us saying the Lord's Prayer around his bed.